frustrated when good, well-meaning people say, well, that's never going to happen, or we can't do that. So, well, wait a minute. Maybe we can. Maybe there are ways to do things to help Ukraine defend itself rather than just discounting, well, we'll never do a no-fly zone, or we'll never have U.S. boots on the ground, or we're never going to do this. There's a lot of stuff we can do to force the Kremlin to start looking over their shoulder.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. NATO countries are bolstering their forces. Poland, for instance, has deployed Patriot missile defense batteries. US, UK, Canada, French, German forces are among those increasing battle force rotations through the Baltics. The largest NATO exercise planned for this year, Cold Response 2022, will bring together around 30,000 troops, 27 nations, deploying troops to Norway, the scenario to help an attacked NATO country. In Ukraine, the Russians continue their invasion, encircling cities like Mariupol and Kharkiv and Kyiv, bombing civilians who can't flee and can't stay endlessly in basements, running short on food and water in winter cold, drinking melted snow. Can the world stand by and watch Russian leader Putin decimate Ukrainian cities? Many think we're in for an escalation because even though Ukrainian forces have fought effectively, they don't control the seas, where Russian ships are shelling from, and the skies are largely controlled by Russian warplanes. And the West increasingly wants to stop this war because supplying anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft systems won't push ground troops back. On this backstory, former U.S. Army Europe Commander Ben Hodges says he now supports the idea of a no-fly zone, and that is gaining momentum. And a Ukrainian journalist who fled Kyiv to western Ukraine on the worsening situation for her friends and colleagues who stayed behind. All right, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges served as the commanding general of U.S. Army Europe, and he is currently the Pershing Chair at the Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Hi, Ben.
Hey, Dan. Good morning.
You recently tweeted, "We must do more than just provide capabilities. We can't stand by while Russians kill civilians as we did in July 1995 when 8,000 Bosnian men and boys were massacred in Srebrenica. There will be huge risks, but some things are worse than the risk of escalation." Can you tell me what you meant?
Yeah, I don't want to see this continued use of terror by the Putin regime continue. I mean, every day we're watching missiles slam into buildings. We're watching firemen try to dig survivors out of the rubble.
Yeah, it's horrible.
And these are deliberate attacks by the Russians on civilian infrastructure. Over 2 million refugees have already left Ukraine. This is a deliberate weaponization of refugees by the Kremlin to put pressure on the Zelensky government and to put pressure on Western governments to where somebody would finally say, dear God, please stop this. We'll do whatever it takes to stop this. So this is a deliberate use of murder and terror by the Kremlin to cause us to crack. We have to resist against that. But when I think back of 1995 and Srebrenica and in the aftermath, everybody said, never again. How in the world could we allow that to happen when we had the power to stop it? Now, look, I'm not naive. There are huge risks associated with any more direct intervention, with direct physical intervention inside Ukrainian airspace or on Ukrainian territory. But we've got to figure out how to do more. A no-fly zone, and I signed a letter endorsing that. That brings with it huge risk, of course. But really, most of the damage is not being done by the Russian Air Force. In fact, a lot of people are asking, where is the Russian Air Force? It has not been that much of a factor. Most of the damage is being done by artillery, rockets, and ground-based missile launchers. So a no-fly zone doesn't really solve the problem. Going after those launchers, the rocket systems, the artillery, will do a lot more to address this problem. And by the way, of course, some of these are coming off of Russian Navy ships in the Black Sea and in the Sea of Azov. So missiles being launched from them as well.
Why did you ever sign a letter saying that you would support a no-fly zone when you know that the potential for direct conflict between NATO aircraft and Russian fighter jets would put us in a potential huge escalation, and Putin has basically waved the nuclear flag at Western countries over this? Why would you advocate taking such a tremendous risk?
Well, first of all, part of this, of course, is trying to decide how serious is President Putin. I mean, would he really use a nuclear weapon? Second of all, the combat power, as well as the diplomatic and economic power of the West, of NATO, dwarfs whatever the Russians have. So at some point, this comes down to, what do we stand for? Are we really going with all of these advantages that we have? Are we, in effect, going to be bullied by President Putin? And then for years later say, oh my God, how did we let this happen? Never again, never again. So at some point, it comes down to power, using power to stare them down. Now, it's easy for me to say. All the pressure, of course, is on our administration and on heads of state and government in other countries. And this would have to be done within the context of the alliance. It cannot be a U.S.-only no-fly zone, or it cannot be even a coalition. It has to. Preserving the unity of the alliance, I think, is an essential part of this.
Right, and I don't think the alliance would go for a no-fly zone, understanding the risks. I don't think they'd ever go for it. I can't believe that you would think they would either.
Look, this is about leadership, Dana. Of course, to the average person thinking, well, we'll never do that. Okay, well, most people said Putin would never do what he's done. And so this is about preventing the murder of tens of thousands of Ukrainian citizens who are being directly targeted. I don't know how this is any different from the Holocaust, where citizens were deliberately targeted by the Nazi regime. And after that, everybody said, never again, never again. So I think we need to be very serious about doing what we can to protect innocent people from a brutal regime, which is what we said we all were going to do after the end of the Second World War. So there are variations on what a no-fly zone looks like. There are lots of people out there looking for different ways to do it. I like the idea of providing capability at a much higher level than what's being done right now. I think that there are several steps we can take before we get to that. For example, the flow of equipment and capability getting to the level of the Berlin airlift. I mean, we're not there yet. It's getting better and it's moving that direction, but we're not there yet. This idea of providing long-range capability that can strike the launchers, whether they're in Russia or inside Ukraine. Ukrainian special forces are very good. Can we give them intelligence and more tools to help them be able to hit those targets? Have we given Ukraine the ability to hit Russian Navy ships, to hit Sevastopol, the Russian Black Sea Fleet's illegal base? So I think that there are so many more things we can do to help protect citizens from deliberate targeting by the Kremlin by going after these ground-based systems. But at some point, the pressure on all of our leaders is going to become so great that they're going to have to either decide, I'm sorry, and stand back, which is what happened in the 30s and the early 40s, or we're going to have to take more action. And of course, that would require very, very deliberate messaging to the Kremlin about what we might do to make it very clear what won't be tolerated. But I don't know how we can stand by and not do more.
Do you think what you're talking about, this escalation, whether it be targeting Russian, launch platforms, rockets, artillery, naval ships in the Black Sea, in the Sea of Azov, a possible no-fly zone? Do you think that these are items that are actively under debate with the US administration and also at large NATO that inevitably people are really looking at escalating the resistance to this Russian invasion, which gets more brutal by the day?
Of course, I wouldn't want to speculate on what planning and deliberations are taking place inside the Pentagon or inside the White House. I would imagine that all the professional planners, both in the Joint Staff and in the department, are thinking through all the options, all the cost-benefit analysis. And I've been impressed with how quickly they have moved on certain things, because it takes a lot of time to move so much stuff, to redirect aircraft, to do all these things. So I've been impressed with that. I can only imagine that planners are doing what they do, which is plan and develop options. But I wouldn't, I don't have a sense of what direction that's actually going.
Can you give me your assessment of the battlefield? Because there's a lot of smoke and haze out there. And I have to tell you, one moment, depending on what I'm reading, I think they're stalled. The Russian war plan is in tatters, and the Ukrainians are holding out in these cities and can do so for a long time. And then on the other hand, they are encircling places like Mariupol and squeezing harder, and people are without food and without water. And even the troops that are fighting in there at some point need resupply. So how do you see the picture?
So I'm actually overall optimistic about the outcome of this thing. Kyiv, I am very sure Kyiv is not going to fall. The Russians do not have the capability to even encircle it, let alone clear it. And I don't think they have the ammunition necessary to reduce Kyiv to rubble. They're not even at that point yet. They've been going after Mariupol now for 2 weeks and Kharkiv for 2 weeks. So that tells me that it's a combination of the will and defensive power of Ukrainian forces, as well as the inability of the Russians to carry out their own plans. They've demonstrated that they are not very good at operational level joint, what we would call joint domain operations, multi-domain operations. So overall, I'm optimistic. Of course, if you're inside Mariupol, it's horrible. If you're inside Kharkiv, it is tough every day and night. But if you can step back from that, after 2 weeks, with all the advantages the Russians had, they're nowhere near accomplishing, I think, what they have set out to accomplish. The logistical situation improves every day for the Ukrainian side overall, whereas the logistical situation for the Russian side gets worse every day. They have a manpower problem. They're starting to recruit now people to join what used to be called the Wagner Group. I think it has a new name now, like the League or something like that. They were asking Syria to provide some fighters. This is where they are. Very interesting opportunity for our side. 1 April is the beginning of the next official conscription wave. That means about 120,000 Russian families are getting ready to have to send their 19, 20-year-old son to become cannon fodder for the Russian army. And also, Russia has just announced what we call stop loss, that all the conscripts they have now are not going to be allowed to leave. So they're encountering serious manpower problems, which makes a challenge when you've adjusted your strategy to one of attrition, where you need time, you need endless ammunition, and you need endless manpower supply. And the Russians don't have any of those three. So I think if I was in charge of the campaign on the Russian side, I would be extremely worried right now.
What is your biggest worry right now when you look at the stranglehold on Mariupol, Navy ships standing off with possible amphibious landings that have been predicted for 2 weeks now on places like Odessa, the troops amassing outside of Kyiv, the constant relentless barrage of Kharkiv? Take your pick, Ben. But I mean, what is kind of top on your list for the next chapter in this bloody conflict?
Well, the worst thing, of course, is the murder of civilians. I mean, this is just so gut wrenching. We hosted a couple of Ukrainian refugees just the other day. I mean, people are a bunch of them were on the train with me from Berlin to Frankfurt the other night, and these are the ones that have made it all the way through Poland and are coming to Germany. And it's amazing to see how Europe is welcoming, receiving these people, these refugees that have lost so much.
Right, and that's 2 million out of there's still 42 million people in that country.
So it's really been an amazing thing to watch, but it's gut wrenching when you know what's caused them to leave. And so the thing that I think is in the front of my mind is how do we stop that? The second thing, though, would be can we keep the alliance together? I mean, that's been the one of the most important aspects of this is all 30 nations sticking together in their condemnation of Russia. More than 20 nations are involved in the delivery of logistics and weapons and equipment into Ukraine. This is a huge effort, and I think the administration deserves a lot of credit for that. But that's not for free, and it's not going to last forever. And so the administration has to continue working on that to continue the support for Ukraine. And look, I acknowledge.
Is the clock ticking on that? If you don't mind me jumping in, is the clock ticking on that? When you take a look at the politics of, France has a looming presidential election. The U.S. has got midterms. There's right now countries have come together and NATO is standing strong. But do you worry about the politics, the domestic politics of each of these countries as this conflict drags on? Do people become firmer in their convictions, or do they wobble and waver?
I think the clock is ticking faster on the Kremlin than it is on us. I mean, as sanctions, the effect of sanctions is not even really hitting yet in most places, other than loss of services. So the sanctions are really going to start taking effect in the coming weeks in Russia. And so I think the Kremlin, sees that they see their manpower problem, their logistical problems. They don't have endless amounts of time, and the Ukrainian side is getting stronger. You're right, of course, there will be lots of other issues that will begin to dominate domestic scene in the U.S. and France and in other places because these sanctions are two-edged in many cases. But on the plus side, we're already in the middle of March. I mean, most of the winter is behind us. So the threat of loss of gas for heating becomes a little bit less severe. I think that as long as we stick together, it's easy to say, harder to do. But the president has made this such a priority that I feel confident we will. Now, also, let me be clear. The no-fly zone is something that will be hugely debated. Most nations have already said, no way. But a week from now, as we watch apartment buildings collapse on top of civilians and so-called humanitarian corridors are attacked by the Russians, as we continue to see this, the pressure is going to be immense. And so I'm not saying that we should just drive on, disregard the risk of an escalation. What I'm saying is we've got to find a way to stop the murder of civilians.
Why do you think that the U.S. didn't accept Poland's offer to supply 30 Soviet-era MiGs to the Ukrainians by passing them through Ramstein Air Base to the Americans, who would then pass them on to the Ukrainians? I mean, they didn't have to be flown on missions from Ramstein, and I assume there are operating air bases inside of Ukraine that the Ukrainians could then take those MiGs. They have the pilots with some short training involved to adapt to the Polish MiGs. They could be up airborne, protecting their own skies. I mean, it sounded like a very reasonable offer.
I think on its face, it is. And probably you've got the right people working on how do you make this happen. But look, there's probably, and again, I don't have inside information on this. I'm anxious to find out. I'm trying to read everything that's out there.
In fact, and Secretary Blinken had given his initial sort of blessing on this idea over the weekend.
No, that's not true. That's not true. What he said was they are actively seeking ways to do this. That's not like it's going to happen. I think what he was describing is the process where you take into account how could we make this happen? What would be required?
I think he said on Face the Nation on the weekend on CBS that he had given a green light.
Okay, well, that's not just a State Department decision. Look, one of the factors, and I hope it happens, by the way, I hope it happens, but you've got to have take into consideration if Poland gives up a significant amount of their air force, no matter how good the cause, if that's not backfilled, the Poles have a healthy respect for the possibility that Russia would launch strikes against Polish air bases. Okay, so I think before Poland uncovers itself, they would need to have some sort of understanding that they would be protected.
They would get replacement aircraft, whether they be F-16s or whatever they be. And then there's also commitments to Taiwan, apparently of F-16 commitments. So I understand it's a detailed, complicated discussion, but in principle, it's a heck of a lot easier to bring about a flying Ukrainian defense of its own skies than it is to draw NATO into a no-fly zone.
I would hope that this comes about. Of course, there are several different flavors of F-16, different cockpits, depending on where they would come from. It's not like hopping in a rental car. I know you know that. I think the right people are involved in trying to think through how do we make this happen. I would be very disappointed, though, if this was held up even 1 hour because somebody inside the White House staff was grumpy with the Poles because the Poles publicly put this out before the administration did, or because there was anything other than just working through the mechanics of how do we do this. But I think people in the department and the Joint Staff could be forgiven for thinking, all right, wait a minute, before we uncover Poland, we got to make sure that part's done too. This is not just an isolated thing. It's part of a much bigger picture. And you're right, we don't have unlimited, airplanes that are ready to fly that are just sitting around waiting for missions and pilots.
Last word to you, Ben. Forward thinking on where we go, and I appreciate your time.
This is worth fighting for. I mean, what we're doing is so important. It's about the lives of innocent people. It's about all the values that we claim to stand up and represent. I think the whole world has been inspired by President Zelensky and by the Ukrainian people, much the way most of us were inspired by the resistance of Great Britain during the early days of World War II. And I think that I am annoyed is not the right word. I get frustrated when good, well-meaning people say, well, that's never going to happen, or we can't do that. So, well, wait a minute. Maybe we can. Maybe there are ways to do things to help Ukraine defend itself rather than just discounting, well, we'll never do a no-fly zone, or we'll never have U.S. boots on the ground, or we're never going to do this. There's a lot of stuff we can do to force the Kremlin to start looking over their shoulder. I would love to see a big, gigantic snap exercise in Georgia, for example. I mean, have paratroopers jump in there. Well, we've done that many times before, and cause the Russians to remind them that because they're taking their troops from all over Russia to put them into Ukraine, they have vulnerable flanks. Or maybe it's time for a nice Navy exercise up in the North Atlantic towards the Arctic. Or maybe it's time for a naval quarantine of the Russian Navy base in Tartus, Syria. Not a blockade, that's an act of war, but a quarantine. Things to remind the Russians of how vulnerable they are and how much more reach we have than they do. And I think that Turkey has more to do. I think that Germany has more to do. There's There are many options for us. But at the end of the day, I don't want us standing around saying, I can't believe we didn't do something to prevent the murder of thousands of Ukrainian civilians.
Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Olga Tokariuk joins me now from Western Ukraine. She is an independent journalist. She's also with the Center for European Studies. Olga, have I got that right?
Center for European Policy Analysis.
All right. Tell me, you were in Kyiv. Can you tell me your story?
Yes, well, I lived in Kyiv for the last 20 years. I'm originally from the Western Ukraine, but I moved there as a student and I worked there as a journalist and lived there. And well, actually, we left before the invasion started. Me and my husband and my daughter, 6-year-old, we left several days before because of all the news, and we just thought, okay, we'll go on a vacation here to the Western Ukraine. If nothing happens, we'll just go back. But unfortunately, now it's not a vacation anymore. We don't know how long we will be staying here and how long we will not be able to go back to our home.
Tell me what you're hearing from inside of Kyiv.
A lot of my friends and acquaintances are still in Kyiv. Some of them are journalists who are reporting on the ground, and some of them are, just like people who do other kinds of jobs. Some of them have joined territorial defense. My friends who are human rights activists, lawyers, IT professionals, musicians, historians, academics, they are joining now to fight against the Russians. These are both men and women. I admire their courage, and they are role models, I think, for me and for many Ukrainians. Also in Kyiv, some of my friends stayed. My friend, for example, she has 3 children. Her husband joined the territorial defense units, so she's alone in Kyiv now with her 3 children, and that's her conscious decision not to go out of Kyiv because she sees it as a way, to show resilience. She says, "This is my home. I'm not going to
say to her when you talk? What do you say to her when you talk? I mean, how young are her children? And don't you say, maybe you should at least take the children out?
Well, of course. Like I tried to persuade her to leave. And like the first week of the invasion, we talked almost daily, and I was trying to persuade her, to convince her that she should think about her children. And she said like she was receiving a lot of similar messages from other people. Her youngest child is less than 1 year old. Her oldest child is 7 or 8 years old, and they are now basically spending all of their days in the basement. But she's also, she's a former journalist. She was working as a tour guide in the recent years, mostly like making tours for foreign travelers. And now she's kind of back to reporting. She's doing a lot of lives with the CNN, with Fox News, with international media, telling the story. And when I last spoke to her, she asked me, please do not persuade me to leave. I'm not going to leave because I feel like this is a place to be. I can tell the world what is happening, being here. And I also feel like a big energy by staying here. Like I feel strength, I feel force, I feel this is a place to be. So we just agreed that, I will not going to raise this issue anymore with her. That's her decision. I respect her. I admire, her courage, although I might not agree with this decision, but I respect her.
You worry for her. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I'm checking, okay, because I don't want to disturb her, like messaging her every day, but I'm checking whether she posted something on social media or on her YouTube channel, because she's posting a lot of videos on her YouTube channel that she had like before the war, that was like a travel YouTube channel exploring Ukraine, talking about the beauty of Ukraine for travelers from all over the world. And now like she transformed it basically in a diary of her life in a bunker in Kyiv. And she's one of many, it's not like the isolated case. And this is also what strikes me, like so many of my compatriots who are still, under this threat in cities and towns that are in danger now, when they hear where they hear the explosions and where they hear fighting really nearby. But these people still refuse to leave. They still stay because they feel like if we leave, like who stays to protect the city if we leave?
Problem is that this war is not being fought under normal circumstance where civilian areas are respected, and an advancing army tries to take minimal casualties of women and children and the elderly who may be on the fringes of this. This is a president who, from Russia, launched a war in Chechnya, and in Grozny, they just leveled the city. They used fuel air bombs and artillery. He's done the same in Aleppo and Syria. He has shown and now in Ukraine, he has shown this propensity to use any kind of violence without conscience, telling Russians very little about what's really happening on the ground. But Putin seems willing to destroy every city.
Well, yes, it might be his plan, but I still believe that his plans can be disrupted. They are already disrupted by the Ukrainian army, but the fierce resistance of Ukrainian army and territorial defense managed to destroy a lot of Russian military equipment and kill, according to Ukrainian figures, more than 10,000 Russian soldiers. These figures, of course, we need to take them with a grain of salt.
Yeah, but even Olga, even if it's 4,000, that's a huge number.
Exactly. It's much more than Russia lost in the previous wars it fought. And we have confirmed information that Russian generals have been killed, those who participated in wars in Syria, also directing airstrikes on civilian infrastructure in Syria. So this information has been confirmed. Russia is suffering heavy losses, much heavier than it predicted. And that, also kind of what fills this Ukrainian people with hope, those who are staying in these besieged cities or cities that are partly, surrounded by Russian army, because Kyiv has been approached from the western side, but still, there is no threat, and Russians have not managed to capture the suburbs of Kyiv on the southern and northern and the eastern part of it. So the hope, I think, of those, I don't know, I think it's hundreds of thousands, if not millions, because the normally population of Kyiv is between 3 and 4 million. And my feeling is that at least half of the people still remain there. So I think the hope of them is that Ukrainian army will not allow them to capture Kyiv, because it's such a strategic, it's the capital, it's a strategic city. And also these people staying there, they kind of they send this message to the Ukrainian defenders, to the Ukrainian army, that we are here ready to help you, we are ready to urban warfare, we are ready to guerrilla warfare. So this is a nationwide resistance effort, not just the army, not just the territorial defenses, all societies engaged in resistance in that or another form.
What does Ukraine need right now?
Ukraine needs to close the sky in some way. Well, it's already clear that NATO is not going to impose a no-fly zone, and Ukrainian officials and the civil society leaders are not voicing that anymore. They were still a couple of days ago. So now what Ukraine asks, okay, if you are not going to close the sky, please just help us to do that on our own. Provide us with fighter jets. There's still reluctance to do so. There was an announcement of Poland that it was ready to do so, but it doesn't seem that the US supports this idea and other NATO allies. Ukraine also asks for, air defense systems. So this is the major priority now, closing the sky, because the Ukrainian army is showing that it's quite effective and quite efficient in the land combat, in the ground combat, but the sky is not protected, and civilians and children and women are continuing to die from Russian missiles and Russian airstrikes.
Can you tell me what your perception of Russia was and President Putin and what it is today?
Well, I have no illusions. I had no illusions about Russian President Putin, at least since 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea illegally, and sent its special forces and military to fight in the eastern Ukraine, in Donbass. So that was already clear, that they will not stop at anything in their attempt to undermine Ukraine. Still, I think me, as many others, didn't believe that Russia would be launching a full-scale invasion. We thought the scope of this operation, I believed it was likely. I believed a new attack, new invasion was likely, but I didn't think the scope would be as far-reaching as it is. They are basically targeting every part of Ukraine. Here in the Western Ukraine, they targeted military objects, airfields. So we are also hearing here sirens and air alerts daily. We have to go to bomb shelters here. Well, of course, it's still safer, much safer than in other parts of Ukraine. So, my perception didn't change much. It changed maybe in the direction of understanding that Putin is not going to stop if he's not stopped. His goal is to destroy Ukraine. We have no illusions here that any promise of Ukraine giving up on its ambition to join NATO, or Ukraine giving up on some like territories, or recognizing the annexation of Crimea or the occupation of some districts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions will kind of satisfy Putin. I think like everybody understands here in Ukraine that his ultimate goal is to destroy Ukraine as an independent state, and that's why like these half measures and compromises are not really what will stop this war.
What would stop it?
The Ukrainian resilience, Ukraine's resistance, but also more courage and more determination from the West. I see that the West is still very much afraid of Putin. The West is afraid of his rhetoric, of his threats to use nuclear weapons or to retaliate if NATO countries help Ukraine to protect its sky. We've heard a lot of like all these Russian threats to Ukraine as well. We're used to them. Like for 8 years, they were dehumanizing Ukrainians on their state TV and describing us as a country full of Nazis, a failed state that will just crumble under the first, Russian attack. And many in the West actually believe that Ukraine will not be able to resist, that Kyiv would fall in 48 hours. This just shows that, both people in Russia and government in Russia and many governments in the West, they underestimated Ukraine, they underestimated Ukrainians. And I think they also underestimate those in the West, their own leverage and their own force and their own ability to stand up to Putin. I firmly believe that this is a war that is not just a war on Ukraine. It's not just a threat to Ukraine. It's a threat to European and global security. Russia currently occupies 2 nuclear power plants in Ukraine. There are reports that torturing the Ukrainian employees of these nuclear power plants. We are on the brink, of an environmental and radioactive disaster if something bad happens at those nuclear power plants. And the reaction of the West so far has been too slow. Well, the sanctions are okay, that's great. They are working, Russian economy is collapsing, but it will still take some time for it, for Russia not to be able to finance this war effort. But more should be done also by standing up to Putin, by not being afraid of his threats, and by not just reacting, but being proactive and showing that the West also has strengths and it has leverage over Russia that it still hasn't used.
If President Zelensky suddenly were to compromise, recognize Crimea, recognize the independence, and then its implied annexation of the Donbass, was to back away and say, okay, let them have a land bridge, along the Sea of Azov, and would Ukrainians support him at that point? Even though he is an iconic figure right now, he could not just take a decision like that, could he?
No, absolutely not now. There is a feeling in Ukraine that, okay, we are in a difficult situation. Russia still has superiority, especially in the air, but Ukrainian army is really putting up a very good fight and, destroying a lot of like Russian troops and Russian equipment. And there is a feeling that there are still resources for Ukraine to fight and to defend more territories from being captured by Russia, and also possibly in the future to liberate some territories that were already captured, although that would be much harder than just defending. So for now, it's not on the table. Any like compromise from the Ukrainian side is not on the table. But if Putin continues to escalate, wiping out residential areas, possibly targeting Kyiv from air, well, they've been launching missiles on Kyiv, but so far Ukraine's air defense was able to intercept those and destroy them. One missile that fell on Kyiv last week killed 5 people. Among them was my former colleague, a TV cameraman, Yevgeny Sakun. But that was one missile that managed to land in Kyiv. There was no other major damage for the capital yet. But if I hope it won't happen. But if Russians are able to target Kyiv and to do to Kyiv what they did to Kharkiv, demolishing basically a historical center, killing hundreds of people, then I think that would put larger pressure on Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, on the government in general, and might push them into give some concessions, but hopefully it's not going to happen, and Ukraine will be able to resist. But Ukraine really needs more support, more military support from the West to do so.
Olga Tokariuk, by the way, I'm very sorry to hear about your cameraman friend, and that a missile fell, ironically and terribly next to a Holocaust memorial site where some 30,000 Jews and many more, Soviet citizens were killed by the Germans in World War II. And here you have President Putin in the Kremlin saying he's fighting some kind of denazification of Ukraine, targeting that site, and which is outrageous, I think. But look, the best to you, and let's be in touch. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's our backstory on Ukraine. If you like this podcast, share it, sign up for all of them. Inside Russia, no one will hear this kind of news. Even calling it a war or invasion can get you 15 years in prison now. And that's why so many journalists have now left Russia. Dark times, and only getting worse. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening to Backstory, and I'll talk to you again soon.